Hello, Sovereign Tech listeners. I have a little surprise for you. That's right, it's the Halloween episode, and so I have a story to tell you. And in fact, it's one of my favorite stories. It's an old story, and it may well be true. Now, as listeners of the show know, I am a huge video game fan, and one of the real first moments when I was like 15, that video games like really became more than just sitting in front of a TV with everybody, but it became like something that you did wherever you went. You know, this is long before Ingress, because we're talking like 1996, was when Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue came out. It was a momentous occasion, and pretty much around the world. In Japan and in North America, it became a big deal. And it came out in North America. It came out right around my birthday, I remember, because I bought Pokemon Blue pretty much instantaneously. But when those games were released in Japan, it was more in February 27th, actually, 1996. Honestly, some strange things apparently happened. A lot of strange things happened with Pokemon. It's a franchise that is pretty controversial. A lot of people feel strange about the fact that, you're pretty much sending out pets to fight to the death, but then they don't really die. But then you find out halfway through, a little bit into, maybe about halfway through Pokemon Blue or Red, that actually Pokemon do die. And it's a real mindfuck when you realize that, because you end up in this place called Lavender Town. And in Lavender Town, you find a ghost type Pokemon, because there's different type of Pokemon. There, fire, water, all the different types of Pokemon that there are. And for there to be ghost Pokemon, that means that there's Pokemon that have to die to create the ghost. And when you realize this, it really, like I said, it's very much a mindfuck that this occurs, because it's like, wait, I thought Pokemon didn't die. And boy, if I was a really young kid, it'd be an issue. And apparently it may have been an issue for some children in Japan. And so I'm going to read some of this story here coming from back then. During the first few days of the release of Pokemon Red and Green or Blue in Japan, back in February 27th, 1996, a peak of deaths appeared in the age of group 10 to 15. The children were usually found dead through, and please, this is going to get graphic, folks, so if you have kids listening or whatever, you shield them, make them aware anyway. Don't shield them. The children were usually found dead through suicide, usually by hanging or jumping from heights. However, some were more odd. A few cases recorded children who had begun sawing off their limbs. Others sticking their faces inside the oven and choked themselves on their own fist, shoving their own arms down their throat. The few children who were saved before killing themselves showed sporadic behavior. This is coming from police reports. When asked why they were going to hurt themselves, they only answered in chaotic screams and scratched at their own eyes. When showed what seemed to be the connection to this attitude, the Game Boy, because Pokemon is a Game Boy game, right? They had no response. But when combined with either Pokemon Red or Blue, the screams would continue, and they would do their best to leave the room it was located in. This confirmed the authorities' suspicion that the games somehow had a connection to these children and their deaths. It was a strange case because many children who had the same games did not show this behavior, but only a few. The police had no choice but to pursue this since they had no other leads. Collecting all the cartridges these children had purchased, they kept them sealed away as strong evidence to look over later. They decided the first thing to do was to talk to the programmers themselves. The first person they met was the director of the original games, Satoshi Tajiri. When told about the deaths surrounding his games, he seemed slightly uneasy, but admitted nothing. He led them to the main programmers of the game, the people responsible for the actual content. The detectives met Takanori Uta, one of the main programmers of the game. Unlike Satoshi, he did not, was that Nakamoto? No. He did not seem uneasy, but very kept, explaining that it was impossible to use something like a game to cause such deaths, and also bringing up the point that that not all the children were affected. He brushed it off as some kind of odd coincidence or mass hysteria. It seemed like he was hiding something, but he wasn't giving it away. Finally, he said something interesting. Takanori had heard a rumor going around that the music for Lavender Town, which you may have just heard, One of the locations in the game had caused some children to go ill. It was only a rumor and had no real definite backup, but it was still something to look into. He directed the detectives to Junichi Masuda, the music composer of the series. Masuda had also heard of these rumors, but again said they had no evidence that his music was the cause. Even to prove a point, he played the exact song from the game completely with no effects to anyone. The detectives, nor Masuda himself, feeling anything different or odd. Although they still had their suspicions of Masuda and the music of Lavender Town, it seemed they had reached another dead end. Going back to the cartridges they had seized from the homes of the children, they decided to take a slightly more direct look at the games. They knew it was these games that gave the children the ill effects, so they took extreme caution. Popping in the cartridge and turning on the console on, the game screen booted. The title screen appeared, and the option to continue or create a new game appeared. Then, when they chose to continue the game, stats of that game appeared. They saw the names of the children who had played, usually Red or another simple name. However, the interesting thing was the time played in the number of Pokemon they owned. On every game, the time was very low, and all of them had only a single Pokemon in their inventory. They came to the stunning reality that it could not have been the music from Lavender Town that had caused such ill effects in the children, since it was impossible to reach that part of the game in such a small amount of time and with only one Pokemon in their inventory. This brought them to the conclusion that something early on in the game had to be the cause. If it wasn't the music nor the title screen, it had to be something within the first few minutes of the game itself. They had no choice but to turn off the game now and go back to the programmers, asking for a list of all the programmers from Takanori. They found surprisingly that one of the programmers had committed suicide shortly after the game was released. His name was Chiro Miura, a very obscure programmer who had provided very little for the game. Even more interestingly, he had requested his name did not appear in the credits, and so it was not. Looking over the evidence found at Chiro's apartment, they found many notes written in bold marker. Most of it was crumbled or marked out, making it very difficult to read. The few words they could find in the mess was "do not enter," "watch out," and "come follow me" in bold. The detectives were unsure what these meant, but knew they had to have a connection. Further searching, they discovered Chiro was good friends with one of the map designers, Koji Nishino, and this was probably the only reason Chiro had given a part in making the game. Koji Nishino, since the release of the game, had locked himself in his apartment, barely leaving in the dark of night to fetch anything he might need. He told his friends and family he was mourning for his dear friend Chiro, but they didn't believe this. Since Niso had locked himself up the day the game was put in stores, a few days before Chiro had killed himself. It was troubling, but the authorities finally persuaded Nishino to sit down and speak with them. When asked if he knew anything about the children who had died after exposure of the game, and if it had any connection to the game, he answered them seemingly carefully, choosing his words thoughtfully before answering. He told them his friend Chiro had an interesting idea with the game, something he had wanted to try since he heard the project was starting. Nishino himself knew Takuri, the director and main programmer, for a long time, so he could easily get a mediocre programmer in on the project with little persuasion. It seemed Chiro had convinced Nero to get him in on the project, and it had worked. The detectives knew they were onto something. This unknown, obscure programmer, Chiro, had to have something to do with it. Something. They asked what Chiro's idea was, why he wanted so badly to have a part in making this children's game. Nishino told them that Chiro never told him much about it, other than a few details every now and then. He wanted to insert a special Pokemon in the game, one completely different from all the others. It would serve as an extra, a kind of out-of-place thrill for the player. But with the gameplay time recorded on the cartridges, it was impossible for the children to have time to meet that Pokemon. It was then that they asked about the notes found in Chiro's home that he snapped. From under the couch Nishino was sitting on, he whipped out a pistol, pointing it straight at the police while backing away a few steps. Then, just as quickly, he brought the pistol to his face and killed himself. It seemed all leads had finally died. The team who had created this original game were splitting up, becoming harder to find. It was as if they were keeping a secret. When the police finally managed to talk with anyone who had parts in the game, even the obscure character designers or monster designers, it seemed they had nothing of interest to say. Most of them didn't even know Chiro, and the few who did had only seen him once or twice working on the game itself. Throughout all of this, the only confirmation they had was that Chiro was indeed the one who had worked on the very early parts of the game. It had been a couple of months after the original children's suicides, and the death rate had dropped dramatically. It seemed that the game was no longer giving any ill effects to any children. The callback of the games that was planned was canceled since it seemed the game was no longer harming any children. They had begun to think that maybe Takanori was right and it was all just a very odd coincidence or mass hysteria, until they received a letter. It was given to one of the detectives himself, quite directly out on the street. It was a woman who gave him the note, a very frail, sick-looking thing. She gave him the letter quickly, telling him it was something he needed to see, and without waiting for a response or another word, she disappeared into the crowd. The detective brought it to his office, calling the others in, and he brought it out and read it aloud. It was a letter by Chiro himself, but it wasn't one found at his apartment. They had thoroughly searched and cleared out the place, so wherever this letter had come from, it wasn't kept at his home. It was signed to be given to Nacino, who had just killed himself. It started off quite formal, a hello, how are you, regards to the family and such. After one or two of these normal paragraphs, they reached a section that requested Nacino to get him into the game team to get him a programming position in Pokemon Red and Blue. As the letter continued, the handwriting seemed to grow more jittery. He talked about a glorious idea he had, a way to programming something unseen in any game before. He said it would certainly revolutionize not only the gaming industry, but everyone. He went on to say that it was a very simple procedure to program this idea into the game. He did not even have to add any foreign programming, but could use what was already given in the game itself. This would, the detectives agreed, make it impossible to notice any obscurities in the programming itself. It was a perfect way to hide whatever this was. The letter ended abruptly. There was no goodbye, no say hi to the family, no write back or thank you, nothing like that. It was just his name written hard in the letter where the paper almost broke through. It was only his name, Chiro Moira. This was the nail in the coffin for the detectives. They had no more suspicion about the cause. Chiro had programmed something into the early parts of the game, something maddening. To further increase this streak of success, they discovered that the programming team had worked in pairs, even Chiro himself, who had worked with another programmer, Susuke Tamada. If anyone knew what the secret in this game was, Susuke Tamada would be the man. This was Sasuke. That would be Sasuke Tamada. This was their final hope of unraveling this mystery once and for all. They learned Sasuke had provided a lot of programming to the game and seemed to be an average good guy and worker. They were easily allowed into his home, a fair place, and they entered his living room where they sat. Sasuke did not sit, however. He stood by the window of the second-story floor, looking out onto the busy street. He was smiling a little. There's no direct witnesses to the events that followed. The only thing from this conversation that remained was found on a voice recorder, sitting on the table in front of the two detectives assigned to talk to Sasuke. What follows is the unedited recording. Sasuke Tamada, what part did you have in the games Pokemon Red and Blue? Asked the first detective. I was a programmer, that's all. Am I right in knowing that the programmers working on the game worked in teams? You'd be right, said Sasuke after a moment of silence. And your partner, his name was Chiro Moira. That was his name. Chiro Moira. Could you tell us if Moira ever acted strange at all? Any particular behaviors you observed while working with him at all? Sasuke answered them. I didn't know him that well, really. We didn't meet up frequently, only every once in a while to trade data, or when the entire group was called up for a meeting. It's the only times I really ever saw him. He acted normal as far as I could tell. He was a short man, and I think this affected his consciousness. He acted weaker than any other man I met. He was willing to do a lot of work to gain recognition. This I do know, I think. Yes, a detective asked. I think he was a very weak man. I think he wanted to prove himself. Regardless of this point, I think he wanted to make himself known for something special, something that would make people forget about the way he looked and pay attention to the powerful mind that lay inside his skull. Unfortunately for him, however, he didn't have much of a mind to back up that reasoning. Why do you say that? Asked another detective. Well, it's the simple truth. He was nothing special. Even if he wanted to believe so, you cannot become greatness even if you believe it. It's impossible. Somehow, I think Chiro knew this himself. Somewhere deep in there, he knew it. Detectives continued, can you tell us what Chiro's part of the game was? What did he work on exactly? Sasuke answered, Nothing. I mean, nothing important. He worked on some obscure parts at the beginning of the game. It was Oak's part, to be exact. He worked on some of Oak's parts when he's seen first, you see. Now, of course, Sovereign Tech listeners, Professor Oak is like the kind of he's not your father, but he's sort of the lead, the character you look to find out information. He gives you your first Pokemon. Let's see, what else pushed the detectives? We know you know about the children and the deaths. We know it was Chiro who did it. He programmed something into the game. Sasuke replied, what are you implying? We're implying that since you're his partner, if you're hiding something from us, then you could just as much be responsible for those children's death as Chiro is himself. You cannot prove anything, Sasuke shouted. Tell us what Chiro did to the game. And Sasuke says, what I told him to. And silence. Complete silence on the tape. You want to know, huh? Sasuke continues on. You want to know what this is all about? Chiro was an idiot. He'd do anything for a bit of attention, anything at all. He couldn't program worth a shit either. The one thing he could do, however, was be manipulated. You could tell him what to do and he'd do it. He wouldn't even question it. He'd do it. Just to hear that thank you when you receive the finished product. That was his reasons. That's all he wanted. I couldn't control him flawlessly. He's a lot like Takanori. Of course, none of you knew this, but I was the one who brought up the idea of the game, the idea of the entire operation. I just told the fellow what to do, and he followed me without doubt. He knows nothing, just like Chiro. Let me tell you about a mechanic in the game, continued Sasuke. Consider it a hint, all right? If you walk around in the grassy areas enough, a Pokemon will appear, and you'll have the chance to go into battle with it. It's a necessary part of the game overall, you see. At the start of the game, you have to walk into the grassy area before Professor Oak appears, and you receive your first Pokemon. Understand me? Under normal circumstances, it was programmed that even though you're in a grassy area, no Pokemon will spawn if you haven't met Professor Oak yet. I made it different. I manipulated that Chiro, told him what to put in the program, gave him all the instructions on how to do it, and he did it flawlessly. It's rare, but it can happen. Stepping into that grass, one Pokemon can spawn. You're as dumb as Chiro was. Once he found out the truth, he had to end it. It was his fault, after all. He shot himself because of it. If you're so determined to finish that case of yours, if you want to know, play the damn game for yourself. Roll the wheel, and who knows, maybe you'll learn the secret for yourself. Suddenly shots were heard on the tape, loud enough to distort the audio. Sounds of screaming, murmuring could be heard. And the next morning, all three, the two detectives, including Sasuke, were found dead at Sasuke's house. And this was not long after what apparently went down with these deaths, perhaps due to playing Pokemon Red or Blue. And that's pretty much it for the report. But it's an interesting story that somehow, just by finding in these certain games, because this is the trick, is that if, before you meet Professor Oak and get your first Pokemon, the game's not supposed to let you find a Pokemon. But then apparently, some were programmed to let you find a Pokemon. And when you did, and then later ended up in Lavender Town, or very quickly ended up in Lavender Town from that, what exactly happened? Now, of course, a lot of people think that this story is complete bullshit, and most likely it is. But it has a few things going for it. One is that it comes from a time before there was, the ability to rip apart any internet hoax. The other thing is that it's in another language in Japan. I had heard the story often when I used to travel to Japan quite a bit. People talked about it. Certainly plenty of people kind of believed it there. And even there where you don't have the language barrier problem, because that's the thing, is that maybe you wouldn't get a proper translation if you looked into stories about this for yourself. And then you have the problem where even in America, it actually happened all over the place, where kids were watching a specific episode of Pokemon, the very popular cartoon that outcropped from the game series. And there was a point where there was an attack, and it created this flashing sequence on the screen. And this put a lot of kids into seizures. Kids had nosebleeds. Kids went into school the next day reporting headaches, feeling very ill, all from watching an episode of Pokemon. And this is in the New York Times. This part of the story is known. This part of the story is a fact. And so the idea that somehow kids playing a video game in Japan, causing them to do horrendous things, to commit suicide and whatever else, almost becomes believable. Especially even more when you consider some recent cases with the Slender Man games. I wonder, did it all really happen? Not a bad Halloween story to end an episode of Sovryn Tech with, is it? Anyway, I will end it there. We kind of went into overtime. But next week, episode 99, believe me, I think you're going to enjoy it. It's not going to be what you think. And then episode 100. Carpe Lucem, everybody. I'll see you on the other side. I wonder what seeing you on the other side means.